Hello everybody, it's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Andrea Giovannetti, and this is better, it comes with me. I am an assistant professor in economics at the Australian Catholic University, and I am co-director of the Tackling Hate Laboratory, where you do things that are quite different from what I'm going to present today. Today, my plan is to present some operative/theoretical elements of a framework that we started developing a few years ago with Paolo Campana back in Cambridge and with other co-authors. When we try to understand the behavior of organized crime groups in a specific area of UK, Merseyside. And then we actually realized that some of the elements of these frameworks were actually potentially generalizable. You decide whether the things I'm going to discuss today may make a sense here in Australia as well. The things I'm going to talk about come mostly from 3 papers. One has been published, it's a work with Paolo Campana, and there's other 2 papers that are work in progress. We submit them, but everything is available to download if you're interested in what I'm talking about. Also, the presentation is available, and if you find an interest in what we are going to discuss today, please contact us, because we would be very keen in extending collaboration on this type of framework with empirical data especially. So, what is the research question behind this broad set of contributions? With Paolo, back in 2022, we wanted to revisit a very classic theme in the literature of urban criminologists, that is the relationship between drug markets and violence. Now, if you're familiar with this literature, you know that it went through several waves of development in the years, starting from the 80s, when large cross-sectional data sets become available to researchers with counts of crimes and features of cities. You know that people started looking at the features of crimes and areas and looking how correlations worked. 2 classes of crimes, drug dealing and violence, particularly clustered really well, and it looks like clustering in specific areas of cities. There is a lot of violence in many drug markets, and drug markets are not uniformly distributed in cities. We know that normally drug dealing is relatively stable in space. It's not randomly distributed in areas, but normally it takes place in micro segments, which is a notion that led people like Professor Sherman to develop the idea that if you target those micro areas, you're going to have a disproportional effect on the level of crime of the whole city for statistical reasons. Forward, in the 90s, better data became available, particularly about the features of the people working around drug markets. And not surprisingly, it turns out that there's lots of activities from certain organized crime groups and within organized groups of certain people. So again, it's a non-random, both in terms of the space, but also in terms of the people involved in this type of business. So far, I didn't say anything, I guess, surprising. We all agree with what I said. Things become more interesting when we move in the early 2000s to the 2010, and thinking about the work from Professor Cinzia Lum in Seattle, but there's also work from Uzai on 250 American medium to large size cities in US. What happened is that when we move in the early 2000s with better statistical methods becoming available to criminologists, people were able to move from this static setting where we pull all the data together to generate analyses that were essentially inherently static into settings where we could study time. And the problem is, when we put time into the framework using panel data methods, for example, a relationship that looked very solid turns out is not necessarily that strong. Correlation between drug dealing and violence is not necessarily positive. You may have many markets that are actually very peaceful. You may have situations where markets undergo transitions, so then you may have instability, violence, and then you get quiet for a while, and then you have violence again. Or even more embarrassingly, it looks like the relationship can reverse. That is, you may see that more violence leads to less drug dealing. Now, this is operationally a gigantic problem. You know that very well if you work on this operationally, because it means that you can't use one class of crimes to make prediction on what happens on the other class of crimes. If you see violence in some areas of the cities, it's very hard to make prediction about what's going to happen on the drug market. there in 1 month, 2 months, 1 year. And at the same time, it's hard to tell what's going to happen if you see an expansion in the drug dealing to make predictions about what's going to happen in terms of violence. In other words, the relationship is spurious. There's many things in between. This was our starting point when we started working on this with Paolo. And we took a very classic idea, that is, very likely the behavior and the dynamics of organized crime groups have to play a role, need to be relevant in between these two important classes of crimes. We are not the first ones doing that, for sure. But differently from other works, what we do here, we don't look at the behavior of, say, one group or a group of gangs in isolation. We try to think about the consequences of changes in the organization of the whole structure. So we look at the meso level and how this can have implications on levels of drug dealing and violence. Very briefly, and this is a sort of a spoiler, the type of framework we develop led us to believe that an important predictor of both violence and drug dealing lays in the degree of cooperation, the quality and the quantity of cooperation we see between organized crime groups in cities. Cooperation can be an important predictor to explain both violence and drug dealing. Now, the story I'm going to tell today, it's about a small area of UK, Merseyside. We're not in UK. I'm going to give a brief details about it, about our laboratory. Merseyside is not big. You can think of it, I live in Sydney. It's the area from the northern beaches down to Cronulla, also comparable in terms of population and density. It's the fourth most populous metropolitan county in UK, but it's very far away from the stereotypical UK countryside. To give you an idea, in the 3.5 years of our data, we witnessed more than 130 homicides or attempted homicides and 100 kidnappings. Myself, I work with the Metropolitan London Police. It's 5 years that I'm working with them on various problems. And I can confirm, but also thinking of other realities, for example, Cambridgeshire crime, the type of crime you have in London is mostly related to peer effects. Merseyside is an entirely different beast for many reasons. Now, you may know that in this area we have Ireland, Liverpool, which is the main city of Merseyside. It's very close to Dublin. And historically, this meant there was a lot of social connection between these two areas. And social connection from the 70s also implied a very florid firearms business from the PIRA movement. Lots of weapons entered the Merseyside area. So historically, gangs in the Merseyside area have a superior firepower. That's also why gangs from outside Liverpool do not stick their nose into Merseyside. And at the same time, the harbour system of Liverpool is one of the most important of UK. If I well remember, it's the top 4 in terms of transit, and it's the most important one for transatlantic freights. Meaning that Liverpool area is very important when it comes to the drug industry for the supply chain, the so-called county line. There's 2 main lines. One is the Baltic line from Iran to Turkey and then up to the Baltics in UK. And the second line is from Netherlands for the cocaine, enters Merseyside. Very importantly, the trade is unidirectional. So Liverpool is a sort of choke point. The drugs get in there and then down through the county line in Manchester, London, then up to Cambridge, Peterborough, and other parts of UK. So lots of stakes in the area, lots of money, lots of drugs, and a high control and agency from the gangs operating in this area. Now, I use the word organized crime groups many times in this presentation. How do we understand gangs in this setting? The building brick is given by crime records. The crime record, we all know it's a very simple type of information. It's essentially a table where you have a crime number in each line, and then to the crime number, to the crime ID, you will have information about the offenders, the location where the crime happened, some narratives, individuals involved, and the type of offense, a time span, and some other thing. Importantly, in our case, the police also gave information about who was a member of organized crime groups, and in which case we also had the ID of the group. And we are tremendously, obviously, grateful to the police because it is an important collaboration. It's two ways. They listen to us, but they share with us their thinking and knowledge about this, the situation. And having this information was extremely important. Now, if I do a good job and they do a good job, it looks like Merseyside is a terrible place. Obviously, I'm very sorry for that, but that's classic tragedy for us criminologists. We live with it. So we had this extra type of information. What we do, we reconstruct the criminal careers for all offenders, around 63,000 individuals. And then we also build up the co-funding network, so we know who is working with in any time period. And the third step, we move one step ahead. So from the individuals, we are going to attribute all the offenses at the individual level to this new unit of analysis, the gang, where the gang is given by the sum of the action of each gang member. And we also translate to this new unit of measure the co-funding relationship. So if two gangs members coordinated on some action, we are going to move this relationship to the gangs. Now, this is a very simple and intuitive approach with a merit, which is it's a robust way to look at gangs because missing one link between two individuals, it's a big deal. Missing a link between two organizations is probably less important. It can be very important, but at least it's less relevant than when you miss a link between two individuals. It's a more robust to look at this type of scenario. On the other hand, if I have time, I will discuss about other ways to visualize gangs using quantitative methods and particularly network theory. We are going to miss some information about what happens within the gangs. Particularly, there are some gangs that have very complicated supply chain structure. Okay, so there's merits, but there's also cost in this approach. Meaning that what we are doing here, it's a gigantic data reduction, because we start big with around 376,000 crime reports, and then we are going to committed by around 63,000 people. So it's essentially the entire population of Merseyside is under monitoring. And then we are going to focus on the behavior of less than 1,200 individuals. And the groups that they generated, so 134 groups. This is the main characters of my story. Now, mind it, it's not that we are going to remove and destroy this information. The information about every single crime in Merseyside is going to be used to characterize areas. And then the main goal of this work is essentially looking at the gangs as a transition mechanism from localized behavior into the population of territory. So we want to see if we can find an effect from the micro to the macro. So you have gang members working for around 3.5 years, very complex relationship, highly dynamic, and then we get into this. This essentially these are the characters of the story I'm going to tell today. The behavior and the dynamics of 134 groups, which again collect the behavior of all the individuals associated with them. Now, I said something about groups. Now let me tell you something about markets. Again, I'm sorry that I'm going to describe Merseyside as a problematic place, and I'm able to do that precisely because the police did a great job and disclosed all the information they had on the topic. If I had to perform the classic exercise from the 80s where you take a static snapshot of the city, put all the data in one go and look at correlations, yes, you will surely find that there's a lot of violence around drug markets in Merseyside. This is violence, this is drug markets. There's many intuitive ways to show that. For example, you can look at every single case of drug dealing and look on average how far is the first act of serious violence. And you will see that normally violence starts clustering around the drug markets in a radius of less than 50 meters. Nothing surprising. Things become more interesting when you start putting time in the picture. At population level, things still look like we are in the 90s and we can build a story about a correlation between these two classes of crime. You can see that Violence and drug markets work closely in tandem. Cross-correlation are pretty strong. Mind it, this is also because these data are heavily trended, so they're both capturing a lot of unknown, and the unknown is the same for both type of data. That's why you see very high cross-correlations. But again, when you zoom in the behavior of organized crime groups, what you see is that the cross-correlation completely collapse entirely. So as a police officer, it's really hard to make a prediction of what's going to happen in a market. If I see a quiet market, I don't really know what does it mean in terms of violence and drug dealing, because the two classes of crimes are not correlated. Now, myself, I have a background in financial mathematics, and when I see a graph like this, and I think everybody here in this room, we immediately see that having a very low cross-correlation doesn't mean that the two processes are disjoints. It's more probably closer to what we call in finance like warping. That is, the two phenomena are probably following something, which is the same type of thing for both cases, but the two series are offset. There's like a temporal offsetting between the two series, okay? You can see that because they're very stable across time and they're compatible. Maybe not in the first moment, so they spin a lot, but in terms of deviances, they're quite similar to each other. So they must be connected somehow. Markets, gangs, let me put them together and let's look at markets with gangs. As an economist, I guess the first question I ask myself is looking at the market structure in the situation I'm studying. And the main thing I'm interested in is trying to understand whether a market is contestable or not. Contestable market in this setting means that gangs are unable to keep other groups away from their own areas. Clearly, a contestable market will have features that are very different from a non-contestable market. If you're in Sicily or in Reggio Calabria, where you have an overarching group, which is essentially taking control of the area, and other groups are not sticking their nose in their own areas, you are not going to see something like this, where we have many ways to measure overlaps across groups. So areas are highly contestable. Many ways, again, to see this intuitively. Let me show you one possible way. Suppose you take every gang in Merseyside and you look at how many areas these gangs are leading on, where leading means they're committing most of the crimes. And then you also look at on how many areas these gangs are not leading, but they are following. So that is, they are the second most important groups. If this was an entrenched environment, you would expect to see most gangs on this x-axis, that is, they would either lead on territories or not stick around. But what we see here is that there's lots of gangs that are leading in many areas, but at the same time, they're also second leaders elsewhere. And guess what? Gangs that are second leading somewhere, they're also more likely to be violent in the areas where they're not leading. So areas are contestable, and they are actively contested. You know, I'm making big words and very theoretical point, but let me make a point using a police operation. Mind it, this is just a story. It's one event. It's not an event study. That's why you don't see confidence interval. But I think it's very helpful to understand the idea that there is a lot of pressure and that gangs do not leave empty spaces. So this is the story of a very successful police operation that started in 2015. The story is made by 4 characters. These lines over there. Let me start from the homicides. So in July, in 2015, in the areas controlled by 2 organized crime groups, there had been a spate of homicides, also involving a young kid. The police decided to monitor those areas, which, mind you, they are discontinuous on territories. They cover various parts of Merseyside. And after around 1.5 years, they performed arrests. It was a big story in the media, also because it was one of the first operations that made heavy use of drones. 45 gangs members have been removed, and the 2 groups have been successfully dismantled. However, as you can see from this purple line over there, after the arrest, the number of uniquely identified organized crime groups in the area went up. Again, groups do not leave empty spaces. Areas are contendable. And at the same time, with more groups entering in the area, you can see that violence went up for 2 quarters. This is violence. And you can also notice that homicides show a destabilized trend. That is, it looks like the police operation actually destabilized the environment. Things change when then, the situation normalized again with the total number of uniquely identified gangs went down at the end of July 2018. I don't have enough data to confirm this claim, so take it with a pinch of grain. But you can see again the tandem. Violence went down with also the number of uniquely identified gangs going down. So probably something happened. One last fact about the gangs, then I introduce some elements of the theory and some results. And this speaks directly to the research of some of us in this room. It's very interesting to look at the structure of cooperation in this context, because again, highly contestable environment, no group has full control of the areas, and if you look granularly at the relationship, a cooperation relationship between the gangs, you will see a highly asymmetric structure. There is a small number of highly interconnected, large, complex groups that stay active along the entire time period, around which there's a constellation of smaller, idiosyncratic, opportunistic groups that performs a set of operations. Then they disappear, they go dormant, then reappear again in the data set. Meaning that the relationship structure is very asymmetric. And one thing in particular, if 2 large groups are active in the same area, it's very unlikely that they're going to cooperate together. Okay? So there's cooperation, but it's highly asymmetric. So let me bring in some elements of the theories, then I show results. As you see, this is a very interesting scenario, which is very far away from other contexts. For example, Japan with Yakuza, or Sicily back in the days with mafia. Probably it's closer to Camorra in the 2000s in Naples. And from the stories you told me today and yesterday in particular, looks like Melbourne with the tobacco, the illicit tobacco trading can also fit this type of environment where you have many groups. Groups are rational, but there's no strong governance, meaning that there's a lot of competitive pressure, and groups in a way fail to coordinate production, which is, I guess, it's pretty interesting. Now, to understand this setting, we have one starting point. We have one entire paper developed around this idea. I don't have to discuss it by having the appendix in somebody's interest. And the idea is, gangs are rational, and they favor business over violence. We see that because when we estimate a model where gangs have to decide which areas to pick to run their own operations, and they face a trade-off between the profitability of the area against the probability of finding that area occupied by some other groups and therefore having to fight, well, it looks like the moment we assume gangs are rational and therefore they will balance trade-offs, the distribution predicted by the model of gangs in the city is actually very close to what we see in real data. And spoiler alert, the most lucrative areas are probably not the most interesting one, also from policy perspective, okay? I keep this on a side. But let me say, we do have evidence showing that gangs are rational and they favor business over violence. But this is true, and it's true that this is a competitive environment. We can start thinking of cooperation as something like a mechanism used by gangs to remove themselves from this competitive setting and essentially run business. Inevitably, the first hypothesis that makes sense to test is whether the relationship between business and violence actually moves in tandem now that you have this new mediating factor, which is cooperation. There's other things that it's worth testing. For example, who collaborates with whom, given this sort of weak governance framework that we have in this setting. Again, it's not mafia. There's not like central coordination. How do I pick my partners? And the idea that we try to explore relative to cooperation is that since this is an illicit illicit markets, so you can't protect yourself writing contracts, you can't insure yourself, you can have a gun. That's actually sounds like how an insurer would work in the illicit market. How do you pick your partners? And our idea is, there are perverse incentives to cooperation when you can't insure yourself against the behavior of your future partner. For example, your partner, suppose there's a deal, the deal is successful between two gangs, then one of the two groups can walk away with the money, or even worse, they can use the money to displace their partner in future interaction. So gangs are surely taking this into account, and the idea we explore is that partners are chosen strategically to minimize the risk of future conflict. Okay? Let me show you something about the results about these two hypotheses. We have other things if you find this interesting. First thing, cooperation. How do you test cooperation in neighborhood? Many ways. A very intuitive and simple way, since we know who belongs to which groups are active in the areas and which groups are collaborating, we can easily build a measure that's telling us how many collaborations we are observing in an area in a certain moment against the potential number of collaboration we could have. The index goes from 0 when you see gangs operating in an area and they're not collaborating either there or anywhere else in the city, to positive values. And this is an index that swings a lot, both in time, but also depending on the various areas. Then take the index and you relate it to the crime in the city. Because the idea is we want to see how much cooperation determines the crime level in the city. And if the theory works, it must be that when cooperation goes down, so cooperation breaks down, competition kicks back again in the framework, violence goes up, and drug dealing goes down. Simple panel data analysis where we control for all fixed effect at area level and also time level. So we account for all those features like deprivation, land use, infrastructure, demographics. And what you see is that whenever the cooperation index doubles up, in the next month you can expect to have 23% increase in the drug dealing associated with a reduction of 4% in the violence. It looks like a small number. Keep in mind, we are looking at the destiny of less than 1,200 individuals, but this number relates to all the violence in the city. Okay? So it's actually a big number. On the drug, we agree that this is mostly run by organized crime groups. So the index essentially is feeding in this information. But what about this? And what matters is that both are significant. So they move in tandem, opposite direction. Mind it, if you try to correlate this thing with this thing, you get a spurious relationship. The relationship makes no sense, it's non-significant. Second result, then I close it, the collaboration. And here I keep it brief. The idea was trying to assess whether market presence is something that matters for gang when they select the partners. So we constructed something which I call here a divergence index, which measures for every gang in every area how much crime the gang is committing without the influence of other gangs. It's like a purity index or a Gini index, if you like. And the result is that for every 10% increase in position asymmetry between two gangs, the cooperation probability is going up by 13%, which is essentially explaining why we see this type of ecosystem where you have large gangs that cooperate with smaller groups, and large groups do not cooperate with each other. In terms of incentives, it makes perfect sense to see this, because small groups, have an incentive to work with larger groups. You get market access, you get resources, you get funds, you get credibility, and larger group at the same time, because you are afraid of what your partner can do in future interaction, are trying not to work with larger groups. Just two results. And a few take-home messages, very slow, because actually, there's much more stuff here. And the main take-home message here is really that tranquil does not mean it's okay. It's not okay. It really depends on many things, particularly what's going on in the area at the meso level in terms of organized crime groups. And the second thing is we found kind of fun to work with this market framework to study something that really looked like an Econ 101 market. It's a competitive market, so many principles of economics apply in this setting too. I think I'm done. Thank you for your time.